the beginning of our activities and lectures sponsored by the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies for the spring semester. And today, to open the series for this semester, we have a new person in the lobby, Professor Sorcire del Moral. She's new Associate Professor of American Studies and Black Studies at Amherst College. So I had the pleasure of meeting her at the end of last semester, and we talked about her coming and participating in our series, and she was very kind to accept. And she's offering the series for the semester. So Professor Del Moral received her doctorate at the University of Wisconsin, and is a new Associate Professor of American and Black Studies at Amherst College. She's a historian of Puerto Rico, the modern Caribbean and U.S. empire. So the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies is happy to welcome her into the family of Latin Americanist, Caribbeanist, and Latino Studies experts at UMass at the Valley. So let me tell you a little bit about her before she talks to you. Professor Del Moral courses examine the dynamic history of Latinos in the United States, with a special focus on the experiences of Caribbean Latinos and Afro-Latinos. She offers courses that focus on of local history and others that highlight comparative and transnational approaches. She also offers a Black Studies class which surveys the foundational literature that shapes the field of Black Studies. She is preparing another course, The History of Afro-Latinos, that will examine the particular ways the experiences of Caribbean Latinos contribute to and challenge the broader Black Atlantic. Her current research project, titled Migration, Diaspora, and Nation. In that project, Professor Del Moral argues that the practice of migration is a constitutive part of the Puerto Rican experience, a defining characteristic of the Caribbean people. The book is an analysis of the relationship between historical narratives, national myth, and Puerto Rican migration. Her first book, Negotiating the Empire, The Cultural Politics of Schools in Puerto Rico, 1898-1952, that was published by the University of Wisconsin Press in 2013, is a history of U.S. empire, Puerto Rican educators, and colonial schools in the first half of the 20th century. And she will speak on those topics today. Please welcome her.
Well, I wanted to thank Gloria and her staff, who I only know as the girls. I don't know names, but I wanted to thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to speak here today and to get to know some of the fellow Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies faculty. So as Gloria mentioned, my first book, which is titled Negotiating Empire, is still a project that I'm working with as I'm transitioning to the second book project. And so today, it's just recently released, so I'm still working with some of those arguments and additional articles from that research. And so what I want to do today, and I should have enough battery life to do it, but as a way of introduction, in the first part of the talk, I'm just going to introduce my arguments about, don't get dizzy, I'll come back to this, but about teachers in Puerto Rico and the history of education. I'm going to talk about that first, and then locate that within a larger discussion of Puerto Rico, education, and empire. And then I'm going to transition to how the project and the arguments about education and Americanization fit into history and the cultural politics of, or the politics of cultural nationalism. So hopefully I can move forward in a straight line and keep you entertained. Well, I can't promise that. And hopefully we can also discuss the images towards the end. If you have any, there's much to say about the images. And I'm happy to discuss, and hopefully you'll have lots of questions and we can just discuss more broadly. And so as a historian, in the tradition of humble historians, I begin reading now, but hopefully not too boring. Okay. So I start in the first part here introducing some of our teachers from Puerto Rico. This image is from around World War I, Puerto Rican teachers You see them standing before a building that holds both the American flag and the U.S. flag. And some of the language that we can't read up there is about buying Liberty bonds. The public school systems and Puerto Rican teachers were recruited into the process of buying Liberty bonds during World War I. But I'm going to begin in the 1920s, especially the first week of December 1920 was designated by the governor of Puerto Rico as School Week, week to celebrate school and activities on the island. And so on the island, that first week of December, Puerto Rican teachers, parents, and students came together to celebrate the progress and the promise of schools in Puerto Rico. There were several local committees around the island that were organized, or that organized conferences, exhibitions, and parades. And they sought to acknowledge schools as, quote, a great factor in the progressive action of the people of Puerto Rico, end quote. In Mayagüez, where you have a reformatory, a school reformatory, in Mayagüez, teachers of the Reform School held a parade and a school festival in the town plaza to generate support for the reformatory on behalf of the townspeople. And so on the morning of December 6th, the students of the Mayagüez Reform School, or the asilados, the inmates of the school, paraded through the city of Mayagüez carrying different banners and signs. And their banners read the topics of the talk. One banner read, "A people who does not educate its children creates its own misfortune." Another one, "Schools signify progress, illiteracy, misfortune." A third, "Attention men in power, more schools, exclamation mark, more schools." And the final one said, "Education is our nourishment," or schools are our pan in Spanish. And so the children paraded through the school with these signs. And so the parade, which meant to testify to the value of schools in the community and to student demand for instruction, generated positive reviews in a local newspaper. There was a newspaper article titled "Hacer Patria," or "To Build a Nation," or "Nation Building." And the article celebrated these school activities, for according to the reporter, they best typified the practice of creating citizens and building a nation. Quote, "The practice of making patria is entrusted in part to the mentors of our youth. Making patria, developing patriots, is the noblest of missions that the guides and the shepherds of people can have," end quote. So in this discussion, the key to forming a modern community of citizens committed to the progress of the nation was education. That meant schools and teachers. The reporter defined patriots, or argued patriots were, quote, "neither created in the battlefields nor in the military. Rather, the patriot and the patria were created, se forman," was the verb that he used, in the school. As the Mayagüez Reform School transformed what the reporter called juvenile delinquents into citizens useful to society, the school was practicing, quote, "the regeneration of humanity," the language of regeneration, end quote. The article concluded with an enthusiastic call for all to support schools in the nation-building process. The article concluded, "Let us build patria through the school. Let us make patriots through instruction." So these activities in Mayagüez captured the relationship between schools, colonialism, and modernity in early 20th century Puerto Rico. Teachers proposed that progress and modernity were just around the corner for the island and its people. And schools represented wheels of change and progress. Schools was the site, it was a location through which all positive, modern, and the word they used was regenerative, methods were practiced. Modern education in particular was key to the transformation. And most significantly, it was the teacher who could unlock all of these promises for students and their families on the island. The changes teachers and schools promised students were greater than just the individual. They imagined the transformation of the patria. The patria must progress and join other modern nations and civilizations. Education, therefore, was additionally a practice in citizenship building. the Mayagüez teachers and students called for the formation of citizens and for community participation in nation-building processes while locating teachers and public schools as the leading actors and institutions. So teachers were proposing a nation-building project. They argued that although the people of Puerto Rico did not, in their assessment, did not yet meet the intellectual, the physical, and the moral requirements of citizenship, with the help of public instruction, they could be transformed into a healthy, moral, and intelligent community of citizens who could together compose the Puerto Rican nation in the future. Teachers would help their students evolve from colonial subjects into national citizens, from illiterates into intellectuals, capable of comprehending and practicing their civic duties. Teachers and educators would reach into the island's most distant, isolated, rural, and traditional communities, various campos, and transform them into a modern, progressive, and democratic nation of citizens. So the Mayagüez activity, the Mayagüez newspaper report suggested that teachers and educators imagine an alternative nationalist project to U.S. colonialism and the U.S. colonial policy of Americanization. This was one of many examples where local teachers on the island promoted their own political vision for Puerto Rico, and significantly today, I'll make the argument that that vision was not Americanization. And I'll explain why that matters. So the teacher's vision for national regeneration, however, also proposed a series of questions. How did teachers define the relationship between the United States as an empire, Puerto Rico as its colonial territory, and citizenship, the language of citizenship that they employed? Teachers called for the formation of citizens and the progress of the patria. Although they identified Puerto Rico as the patria, their definition of patria did not deny in any way the island's colonial relationship to the United States. In fact, teachers deployed an expansive and dynamic definition of the words patria and nation, definitions that were deeply informed by the island's late 19th century history of autonomism. Teachers saw no contradiction in the formation of a national identity rooted in a territory that remained, quote, under the protection, end quote, of a larger imperial power. A second question that emerges was, how did teachers define regeneration, progress, and modernity? These are the concepts that they engage. Their writings, their lectures, and their practice suggest that citizenship building required a regeneration of sorts. The concept of regeneration was deeply informed by neo-Lamarckian eugenics. Teachers made assumptions about whom and what was holding back the wheels of progress. It was the people themselves, obviously, the students themselves. Both rural peasants, jibaros, and urban workers represented the physical manifestations of dysgenic genes and practices. Teachers looked at their students in the classroom and identified in their bodies, in their physical bodies, the alleged effects of poverty, tradition, and ignorance. So the scientific or the pseudoscientific racial theory of neo-Lamarckian eugenics, as interpreted locally by Puerto Rican teachers, promised regeneration. Through the sanitation of the home and the streets, communities could be cleansed. That implied doing away with social poisons, such as alcoholism, prostitution, gambling, and concubinaje, or consensual unions. Through the modern and scientific instruction of physical education, domestic science, rural agriculture, teachers could lead the transformation of their students, communities, and therefore, by extension, the patria that was Puerto Rico. This quest for regeneration, in turn, generated other questions. Who were these teachers? Who were they to allege that students and families were somehow degenerate? how were they, teachers, different than the students they taught every day on the island? In the early 20th century, teachers, in fact, were a group apart. Teachers had great cultural capital in early 20th century Puerto Rico. Simply, unlike the majority of the population at the time, clearly they were literate. They owned their skills and their knowledge. They were considered professionals in charge of local schools. They were leaders in the community, local, rural and urban. Teachers, however, or therefore, also generated a deeply paternalistic relationship with their students and with the parents. Teachers were a sort of intermediate actor in colonial society. They held some authority over their students and they held the respect of the community. However, U.S. officials, colonial officials, expected them to implement education policies directed at them from above by the Department of Education, while students and parents from below made their own demands. So they were intermediate in that way. And let's not forget that teachers had tremendous sense of self-esteem. They held themselves at the center of change in Puerto Rico. If the island was to progress, to modernize, it would be at the hands of teachers. So I propose, one of my main arguments is that by centering teachers, schools, and education at the heart of our discussion of early 20th century Puerto Rico, we can better understand how intermediate actors in colonial Puerto Rico, not only the elite, not only the subaltern, intermediate actors in colonial Puerto Rico contributed to the dynamic relationship between empire, nation, and citizen. We can discuss their beautiful outfits at the end of the presentation. So that leads us to a larger question about education and empire. And here, I just want to give a very brief story and kind of brief history, and then insert Puerto Rico into the conversation. As some of us may know, in the year 1898, the United States invaded Puerto Rico during the Cuban War of Independence. It acquired Puerto Rico from Spain through the Treaty of Paris, and it occupied it with a military government for 2 years. From 1900 until 1952, Puerto Rico was legally defined as an unincorporated territory of the United States. There were changes in colonial constitutions. There were a series of constitutions, and in 1917, Puerto Ricans born on the island were granted U.S. citizenship. Puerto Rico, however, was to remain an unincorporated territory, which meant it was not on the path to independence like Cuba. It would not be incorporated as a state like Hawaii. It would remain a colony. Puerto Rico was valuable to the U.S. empire for multiple reasons, some of which we may be aware of. Access to the Panama Canal, the military bases in the region, the U.S. presence in the region. Puerto Rico was a location also for U.S. capital to invest in export commodities, particularly sugar, in the early 20th century. For military and economic reasons, it was important for the U.S. to establish a colonial state on the island of Puerto Rico, and that the island remain under the control and authority of the U.S. Congress, and that it served the interests of the U.S. empire. This is a standard narrative since Walter Lefevre on, which means the 1960s, on. Okay, my argument is, this image encapsulates it, but we can discuss the image in more detail later. Education, the classroom, education and schools were at the heart of the U.S. colonial project in Puerto Rico. In addition to sugar, in addition to the base for labor, in addition to military bases, schools was at the heart of the U.S. colonial project in Puerto Rico. U.S. colonial actors were invested in generating support for U.S. colonialism on the island, long-term support for U.S. colonialism. And one way to accomplish this was by attempting to convert colonial subjects into what one historian has called tropical Yankees, through the teaching of English and the celebration of U.S. history and U.S. patriots. So U.S. educators, primarily administrators, aggressively promoted the new colonial state ideology of Americanization, not unique to Puerto Rico, part of the mainland United States, and obviously Hawaii and the Philippines. But Americanization ideologies, you know, they could be broad, they could be narrow, they could be constructive, they could be deeply destructive. They imagined the transformation of colonial subjects into second-class citizens under the assumption that they were not to be fully incorporated into the U.S. nation. So schools and curriculum in Puerto Rico evolved in conversation with comparative examples and comparative experiences of Americanization, which guided Native American boarding schools in the United States, African American industrial training institutes, as much as they reflected 80 years of history of Americanization practices on the territory of Hawaii. In Puerto Rico, in particular, the goal of the U.S. colonial state was to carry out a school project that intended to uplift, to regenerate the new colonial subjects within the broader framework of white supremacy in the U.S. nation and empire. Americanization, therefore, reflected the racial, ethnic, and cultural hierarchies and practices of early 20th century Puerto Rico. It was very much historically specific. Some of us may be aware of Aida Negrón de Montilla's work. Aida Negrón de Montilla is one of the main scholars in the history of education in Puerto Rico, and she defined Americanization specific to Puerto Rico. And she argued that the intention of Americanization in Puerto Rico was to displace a native Puerto Rican culture with an American one, or to promote the assimilation of Puerto Rican culture into a U.S. dominant culture. And in her work, she documented the multiple ways that U.S. commissioners of education intended to inculcate the students on the island with a love of all things American, through the teaching of U.S. history, through the supplanting of Puerto Rican patriots with American ones, through the daily ritual in the classroom of reciting the U.S. national anthem, and through the example of patriotic holidays and parades. The underlying assumption guiding Americanization policies, according to Negrón de Montilla, was an ideology that maintained the superiority of U.S. cultural values and the inferiority of Puerto Rican ones. And it was the leadership of the Department of Education, particularly U.S. commissioners, who were responsible for implementing these policies. So by the 1920s, this is the top-down project of Americanization. By the 1920s, however, the majority of the teaching class on the island was composed of young adults who came from middle class. It's hard to call them middle class, we can call them intermediate or middling groups and backgrounds on the island. Many came from top schools, high schools in urban towns, although many were bilingual because it was a requirement, or English language exams were a requirement to be certified to teach in local schools in Puerto Rico. So many of them were bilingual, but they were native Spanish speakers. They had been trained at the University of Puerto Rico by both Puerto Rican and U.S. educators. They had been, their generation, instilled with the ideology of Americanization that I just described according to Negrón de Montilla. However, clearly, teachers were not empty vassals, for they came to the profession with the class, gender, and race biases that informed the social hierarchy that was turn-of-the-century Puerto Rico. Teachers, therefore, were not there simply to practice Americanization according to U.S. colonial administrators. They actually represented one of the biggest obstacles in the classroom for the implementation of Americanization. Teachers, although civil servants, were an obstacle to the goals of the U.S. colonial state. I will add, the fact that the majority of teachers were Puerto Rican rather than American, however, does not imply that they were inherently guided by different philosophies and intentions. In fact, Puerto Rican teachers shared many similarities with early U.S. teachers, as well as the teaching profession in other Latin American and Caribbean countries. The new generation of Puerto Rican teachers negotiated their relationships with both local communities and the centralized colonial state. In case there's a Mexican scholar in the classroom, that's one of the dominant tropes of post-1910s Mexican historiography. And that's where the subtitle of my book comes from, Mary Kay Vaughn's work. So the teachers advocated for a citizenship building project that would serve emerging national Puerto Rican identities in the early 20th century. While teachers allowed for a definition of Puerto Rican identity that was associated with the United States, they did not promote the creation of either tropical Yankees or of U.S. Americans. local teachers and educators in Puerto Rico stood out as one of the historical actors that might challenge the top-down intentions of the U.S. colonial state project. Teachers, therefore, were not simply transmitters of U.S. colonial policy, but rather critical actors who challenged and negotiated Americanization ideologies daily through their practice in the schools. That is how the product of teachers and education fits into our larger conversation of education and empire. Now I want to turn to Americanization and U.S. empire in history and historiography and cultural nationalism, which is my way of addressing the question, the so what question. Why does this matter? Excuse me. So scholarship about Puerto Rico, Puerto Rican scholarship, has been dynamic, it has been innovative, it informs our understanding of the malleability of U.S. empire and U.S. colonial practices on the island, more broadly in the Caribbean. It also speaks to the Pacific throughout the early 20th century. While acknowledging the political framework that emerged when the U.S. acquired, occupied, and retained the island as an unincorporated territory, scholars have proposed the multiple ways that local actors negotiated the top-down intentions of a new U.S. colonial state. This is by now the norm, not the exception. Nevertheless, while authors have reevaluated the negotiated processes of state formation, colonialism, and empire building in Puerto Rico, none, or I should say few, in case some have, few have proposed that one of the principal symbols of U.S. empire in Puerto Rico, education and Americanization, were also negotiated. I think education and Americanization remain kind of sacred cows in U.S. Puerto Rican historiography. I'll explain why. Scholars have not challenged the dominant interpretation that U.S. colonial school policies, specifically Americanization, were frighteningly oppressive, repressive, top-down, and somehow omnipresent in the first 40 years or 50 years of U.S. history on the island. This interpretation of Americanization, which proposes that it was a self-serving U.S. colonial policy that advocated for the cultural genocide of Puerto Rican people's culture, heritage, language, and history, has generated a complementary narrative. It has allowed for the conceptualization of teachers as heroic actors who defended and cultivated emerging Puerto Rican national identities at the risk of professional censure, at the risk of being fired. So the trope of Americanization, despite the fact that it falls within the larger conversation about U.S. empire, has survived and reproduced a dichotomy of oppression and resistance. And the question for us is simply why. Everything else has moved beyond oppression and resistance. Why do schools in Americanization still remain sacred within that conversation? I argue that Americanization retains a dominant position in early 20th century conceptualizations of U.S. empire in Puerto Rico for multiple reasons, and I just want to discuss two today. The first speaks to questions of historiography, methods, and sources, and the second is informed by the politics of empire and cultural nationalism in contemporary Puerto Rico. And by contemporary, I would mean post-1950s Puerto Rico, as a historian. Everything contemporary. So let's look at the first one regarding narratives of Americanization. As I mentioned, the most significant contribution to the early 20th century history of education has been Aida Montilla-Montill's work, specifically her book, The Americanization of Puerto Rico and Public Schools. Now, Negrón de Montilla's study was a history of top-down policies, a key word, top-down, promoted by U.S. Commissioners of Education. U.S. presidents appointed U.S. governors and U.S. Commissioners of Education. So Negrón de Montilla carefully documented how in the early 20th century, Despite some variations in the visions of individual commissioners, Americanization was fundamentally the primary political framework that shaped the founding, the organization, and the maintenance of public schools of the island. Ultimately, she argued, commissioners were guided by the intention to cultivate a new generation of students who could be pro-American and supportive of U.S. colonialism. The term tropical Yankees comes from Jose Manuel Navarro. Okay. Now, the cultivation of pro-U.S. colonial subjects was imagined to come to fruition through tight control over a new curriculum that promoted U.S. patriots and civic history and U.S. definitions of progress and democracy and modernity. So at the core, the goal of schools, the control that commissioners had over the curriculum in the classroom, was Americanization. And at the core of Americanization in Puerto Rico was the teaching of English as the language of instruction. English as the language of instruction meant not teaching English as a special topic, but teaching in English in the classroom every day. That's our dominant position. And it is significant that Negrón de Montilla concluded her study from the 1970s, concluded her study by recognizing the limitations of one of her primary documentary sources, which are the annual reports of the Commissioners of Education. So these Commissioners of Education, who were appointed by the U.S. President, produced annual reports, who they then submitted to the U.S. President. So it was the Commissioners' reports were a conversation between elite administrators of the island and the U.S. President. It was a conversation that meant to document the alleged successes of Americanization efforts in Puerto Rico. Look at what a good job we are doing in the classroom. Americanization is fundamentally a success. So Negrón de Montilla, at the conclusion of her book, said, I recognize that that is a limitation of my source, that is the story that I'm telling, but I'm calling on researchers to look at different sources that can document the extensive resistance to the history of Americanization in Puerto Rico, and to look at other perspectives about colonial education in the early 20th century. And I say this simply because despite her own recognition about the limitation of these historical sources in Puerto Rican history, that source space, the annual commissioner's reports, continues to be one of the foundational sources in early 20th century history for Puerto Rico. That means that the argument built from these sources, that the U.S. goal was to Americanize Puerto Ricans, and that without teacher and student resistance, Americanization would have generated the social death of a generation of Puerto Rican students. That also continues to be the dominant argument. It's based on those sources. Okay. So simply, I'm calling for an acknowledgement of the limitation of those sources and that argument as well, and all of the derivative arguments that come from there. I'm proposing that those sources and that argument does not tell the entire story, because no matter how carefully we try to employ critical historical methods and try to read between the lines and against the grain, those sources cannot offer the perspective of Puerto Rican teachers themselves, teachers who had already been practicing in Puerto Rico since before the arrival of the Americans. Those sources homogenize, the argument homogenizes the important identities and divisions within the new generation of teachers that emerged really by the 1920s. And those sources in no way can represent the demands and expectations of parents and students in Puerto Rican schools. Therefore, I think at the end of Negrón de Montilla's scholarship, and the question that our generation is taking up is, what have these government-produced sources and top-down conceptualizations of Americanization left out of the story? Whose voices have been excluded, sanitized, and silenced? How have scholars inadvertently reproduced these silences in their own analysis of the same sources? And can we, as students of history, invested in providing a critical and nuanced understanding of both U.S. colonial practices and Puerto Rican history in the early 20th century, produce a more balanced story? So providing a critical history of early 20th century Puerto Rico, one that privileges the contributions of non-elite historical actors, therefore requires that we ask broader questions and that we search for different sources. So fundamentally, one of my arguments here is that the narratives of Americanization, despite having come out of a very limited type of source, continues to be reproduced, generation after generation after generation. And that the narrative of Americanization reproduces a simple dichotomy of oppression and resistance, and that the narrative of Americanization is important, significant, and a contributing factor to the politics of cultural nationalism in our colonial / post-colonial context. Okay. So why does this matter to cultural nationalism? So while Puerto Rican cultural nationalist identities are vibrant, cultural nationalism is dynamic, cultural nationalism is also fragile. Cultural nationalist identities are constructed, practiced, and reproduced within a modern version of a colonial state. For despite the celebration of cultural nationalism in post-1950s Puerto Rico, fundamentally the island lacks political sovereignty. While it functions as a semi-independent state associated to the United States, it remains a colonial territory. Therefore, everyday reminders of U.S. authority and presence on the island, evident in the existence of the military bases or through the fear of contamination of popular culture and language, these generate tremendous anxiety and require that cultural nationalists continue to clearly reestablish the boundaries between, quote, Puerto Rican and, quote, U.S. American race. It's important to make that distinction. So what is cultural nationalism? In case we don't know, Puerto Rican intellectuals and scholars collaborated with Governor Luis Muñoz Marín and the Partido Popular Democrático, or the Popular Democratic Party, in the 1950s to define cultural nationalism. Cultural nationalism became a state-sponsored identity that has served both the colonial government and multiple sectors of Puerto Rican society. At the core, very simply, cultural nationalism celebrates a definition of Puerto Rican authenticity that is constructed in direct opposition to that imagined to be American or U.S. American. This is a crude definition, but very simply, Puerto Ricans speak Spanish, Americans speak English. Puerto Ricans embody a history of racial harmony, while Americans are white supremacists and maintain rigid racial hierarchies. Puerto Rican women flourish within the Gran Familia Puertorriqueña, or the great Puerto Rican family, and find freedom of expression through social feminism, unlike U.S. women and feminists. U.S. feminist ideologies tend to fall outside of the family, right? This dichotomy produces obviously unrealistic and uncritical generalizations of both groups, of both Puerto Ricans and Americans. According to the cultural nationalist narrative, in addition, Puerto Rican cultural identities, best personified through the performance of difference, language, racial harmony, and gender roles, have survived in spite of the virulent and oppressive Americanization campaigns of the early 20th century. So as scholars have proposed, emerging Puerto Rican national identities were constructed in opposition to the other, the Americanos. Now, within the cultural nationalist ideology, two cultural markers are particularly susceptible to contamination, and that is language and history. English language instruction was a requirement of Americanization policies. Therefore, the imposition of English language instruction in the early 20th century was a direct challenge to Puerto Rican culture and identity, for Spanish was the vernacular in homes and families. English language instruction provoked fears of cultural genocide. The U.S. intention to impose English language instruction generated resistance from teachers, parents, politicians, intellectuals, from others. This resistance to English was not a myth. It was a fact. It's a well-documented part of Puerto Rican history. And teachers led the opposition to English language instruction, and teachers suffered the consequences of their opposition. That meant professional repression, blacklisting, and firings. Spanish language policies continued to inform contemporary cultural nationalist debates. In turn, A defiant resistance to English, a glorification of Spanish, and a rejection of Spanglish are important national performances. In this way, language and Americanization are important to cultural nationalism. In addition, history and historical narratives, public school history textbooks are equally important and contested in cultural nationalism. Whose history is taught in island schools? In fact, in the first half of the 20th century, history texts written by Puerto Rican scholars that proposed an island-centered interpretation of history were denied distribution in colonial schools. The textbooks that were approved instead proposed a different interpretation of history and Puerto Rico's location within it. It was the Commissioner of Education, the individual appointed by the U.S. President, who had the right to authorize which textbooks could be used inside of the classroom. And in fact, the first textbook approved for Puerto Rican schools was written by one of the Commissioners of Education, Paul Miller, Historia de Puerto Rico, and it proposed a narrative that framed local history of Puerto Rican history as a model study of modern and benevolent U.S. imperial practices. So textbooks, history, whose history is told, but Miller's in particular, dismissed island history before the arrival of the U.S. It minimized Puerto Rico's location in the Caribbean. It celebrated the United States and Puerto Rico. Now, the cultural nationalism of the 1950s has revolutionized history textbooks and the use of history in the curriculum. So the interpretation of history is equally important to cultural nationalism. Historical narratives and the language of instruction remain two markers of national identity that have to be defended from U.S. colonial impositions and cultural contamination. Okay. Now, it is at this location in cultural nationalist narratives that the history of Americanization policies and schools comes back in. Okay? Fundamentally, the early history of Americanization serves as one of the best examples that represent the dichotomous construction of oppression and resistance, of us versus them, of colonialism versus nationalism. And history and language remain deeply connected to contemporary debates about authenticity, identity, and nation. This suggests that a revision of Americanization scholarship, which is what I'm proposing, a revision of the Americanization scholarship might appear, I think, initially and at a superficial level, to be undermining the nationalist narrative built on notions of difference and cultural heritage. But instead, I propose that a critical study of the cultural politics of colonial schools in the first half of the 20th century instead can help liberate the history of education from rigid, nationalist narrative constructions by allowing for a more well-rounded understanding of how local actors chose to engage with colonial schools and by extension chose to engage with the colonial state, while fully aware of the power relations between the colony and the metropole. I nevertheless suggest that teachers and parents engaged colonial schools in a way that both, thank you so much, teachers and parents engaged colonial schools in a way that both condemned racist Americanization policies while also contributed to and complemented a broader racial and social uplift project. Excuse me. This collaboration, the teachers' everyday collaboration, I argue was a negotiated process, and it reflected how intermediate actors in the colonial hierarchy practiced the Puerto Rican political ideology of autonomism rather than outright revolution or annexation. This daily negotiation of local actors with the colonial state was carried out through local schools. Therefore. It was not simply a transmission of top-down policies, of Americanization policies to the middle, to teachers, and from teachers down to parents and students. Instead, the three sectors, the elite, teachers, parents, and students, found ways to negotiate their interests and their visions without undermining the authority and the framework of the colonial state. A revision of the history of Americanization, therefore, can help us understand how intermediate actors, like teachers, contributed to the formation and the resilience of a modern colonial state. I propose, a history of education and U.S. empire in Puerto Rico that replaces the dominant image of the U.S. flag, which was the image on the flyer of a little girl with the flag. I propose that we replace the dominant image of the U.S. flag when we say, oh, the history of education in Puerto Rico. Instead, replace it with images of Puerto Rican teachers. The early history of education in Puerto Rico should be told from the perspective of teachers. Without denying the framework of empire and colonialism, and without denying that colonial schools were in fact repressive and hostile spaces for teachers, without minimizing the movement against English language instruction, I propose that we not forget the multiple ways that teachers engaged colonial intentions in order to more effectively promote their own vision for citizenship and regeneration. At the same time, I suggest that we not romanticize the way the Teachers' Citizenship Building Project was also informed by island-based race, class, and gender hierarchies. The Teachers' Project offered its own limitations. In many ways, it was a conservative vision. It was very much historically specific. Nevertheless, in the end, I propose teachers negotiated with empire in a way that mediated U.S. colonial intentions that were imagining the creation of tropical Yankees. That's all I have. Question? Yes.
So that's lovely because it's a very nuanced new approach, I guess, a more nuanced approach to seeing what the historic dynamics were. So could you tell us a little bit about the documents, or all of a sudden I feel like I need to read the rest?
Yes. That's a great feeling to have at the end of the
what are those stories?
Okay.
What are those stories of mediation and negotiation?
So what happens is that the focus has been on these government-produced documents and sources. In fact, as some of us may or may not know, the teachers organized into a union in Puerto Rico in 1911, Teachers Association of Puerto Rico. They met annually, and they met throughout the year, and they had annual conventions since 1911, and they recorded the minutes of their meetings. Teachers also published in an education journal, which they shared hesitantly with the Department of Education, called the Puerto Rico with an O, School Review. Teachers published regularly in the newspapers, especially in teachers wrote memoirs and that were published to small presses on the island, etc., etc. So I looked at those sources instead, or in addition to the government sources. And what I found was the project that I presented at the very beginning. Teachers said, okay, these are our classrooms. We're going to teach in our language, but in addition, we're going to teach physical education, we're going to teach agriculture, we're going to teach home economics, and we're going to teach civics. We don't want to teach home economics according to the American version. We don't have stoves in El Campo in Puerto Rico. So we're going to teach our own version of home economics. We're going to teach rural agriculture so that our farmers are not sugarcane workers, but they can have their pig farm or their plantain farm. So they had very specific visions for the labor that they wanted to generate in Puerto Rico, and for the gender roles, what boys should do and what girls should do, for the racial hierarchy that they sought to establish, the rural peasant versus the urban worker. And so they made demands every year. At the end of this convention, they had a representative who went before the legislature and before the U.S. Commission of Education, and they said, this is what we want. We want these textbooks, we want these topics, in addition to better salaries, tenure, healthcare, etc. And the commissioner said, that's great, but no, you know. And that happened, that went on and on and on. And so then we have negotiations over language, negotiations over the textbooks, negotiations over salaries fights over rural schools and urban schools. But what you find is that the teachers never, even though they have their own divisions, they never stop promoting their vision. And it was a vision of progress and modernity. But that's a very, in the 1920s, racialized vision of regeneration. That's what they did. That's what the writings show, that's what the newspaper articles show, that's what the minutes show, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's the story that I develop at length, chapter by chapter in the book. But it's situated in contrast to the dominant perspective of Americanization.
Can you say a little bit more about the reasons that the teachers decided to engage the process, the project of Americanization, rather than simply resist it?
Okay, so, you know, I wanted to write the history of teachers.
Right.
And I wrote the history of teachers because those teachers who chose to say, I am challenging the U.S. colonial state in the classroom, I am bringing in the Puerto Rican flag into the classroom, were simply fired. I mean, they were fired. They were decertified. High school students who demanded that they have the right to carry the Puerto Rican flag during graduation ceremonies were denied their high school certificates and were denied admission into the teacher training courses at the University of Puerto Rico. So it was a very oppressive system, especially in the classroom. So what happened was that teachers early on realized we cannot carry the flag into the classroom and oppose. I mean, we can, but those are the ones who become private teachers. And I'm looking at the teachers who continue to practice in a colonial classroom. So they realize they're not, in a classroom that is a colonial classroom, you don't have the opportunity to overtly overthrow a colonial regime. That doesn't fly. But you do have, when you're not being directly inspected by inspectors that came, you literally had inspectors that came, you could teach in Spanish when the inspector was not in the classroom. You could, instead of teaching, like I mentioned earlier, the home economics curriculum that came from the United States about using modern appliances, you could teach what you thought was the appropriate teaching method for rural mothers in the classroom. And so there was a tweaking of the curriculum within the established boundaries in order for teachers to promote what they thought was relevant and specific to Puerto Rico. And this was a fight and an argument. And teachers wrote about how it was a fight and an argument. And when teachers were suspended for teaching certain types of home economics classes or not teaching in English, they wrote newspaper articles and complained about it, and parents rallied behind them. I should say this has never really ended in Puerto Rico, right? But this is a very specific way that teachers said, well, I can't carry the Puerto Rican flag into the classroom. Well, then, given limitations, what can I do? And so that's what the sources show, what they did constantly. And what they did is very different than what the commissioner's reports report they were doing.
Do you have documents that show anything about how they might have been going to conferences with other Caribbean countries, Latin American teachers, more around?
So, it's hard, you can't study Puerto Rico in a vacuum. Nor can you study Americans in Puerto Rico in a vacuum. There are so many different ways that these individuals were traveling. At no moment were those U.S. colonial administrators in Puerto Rico not also involved and informed by what was happening in Cuba, in Cuba schools, what was happening in the Philippines as well. What was happening in Hawaii was an example for what could happen in the other colonies. And so there's certain nodes of concentration, like Teachers College at Columbia University, which had lots of Americans that went down to the island and were engaged in these different things. But in addition, throughout the early 20th century, you have lots of Puerto Rican teachers that are being sent to the United States, to Teachers College, or to Howard University, Tuskegee Institute, and to Native American colleges in Pennsylvania area to learn U.S. pedagogic methods, right? And so Puerto Rican teachers are coming to Puerto Rico. Now, in addition, and this is really a phenomenon of the 1930s, when Mexico becomes the best example of a state-sponsored secular instruction, socialist in particular, especially in rural areas and with the intention of creating a national culture. What you have are the leaders of Puerto Rican schools who the leaders by the 1930s, Puerto Ricans replaced Americans in positions of administration. And so you have administrative leaders in Puerto Rico traveling to Mexico to attend workshops on the successes of rural instruction in rural Mexico, then coming back to Puerto Rico and writing articles about it and publishing it both in newspapers and the Education Journal. This is very important, for it was very radical. So we have this commissioner that comes in the 1930s, Jose Badin, and his other administrators, who say state-sponsored education in the service of rural instruction can be very wonderful, and socialist. And then that individual, of course, is fired as a result of promoting a not nationalist, nativist economic project, right, and replaced by others. That's the negotiation there. In the Puerto Rican education journals, you have articles from educators in the Philippines, right? So you have educators in the Philippines, or articles about dentists and doctors in the Philippines, traveling to different Filipino islands throughout the archipelago to bring, in canoes, to bring health care. And then you have those type of articles published in education journals in Puerto Rico to say, my dear teachers, you can take health care to the Jibaros if the Americans can take dental clinics to the Philippine Islands, right? So there's constant. And so I think I don't want to say constant. It's there. You just have to look for it. It's a little different. It's not in your face. But it's an example of, I think, in the U.S. empire literature, they're no longer looking at U.S. out or colonies in, but different nodes and moments of exchange, and the classroom allows for that. So the teachers are within the Caribbean, Latin America, and the U.S. Argentine education is also very important in Puerto Rico, in terms of those who they cite and the examples. Yes.
Were there any influences that happen in religion because of the classroom? Like the American ideals of religion, is that implemented in the classroom as well?
Absolutely, and there's, of course, not of course, but the work of Silva Gotay on Protestant religion in Puerto Rico is also partly discussing the role of religious schools in Puerto Rico. And so what happens on the island is that the public schools are secular and coeducational, and religion is not explicitly a topic of study. And then you have private schools that are part of the 5 different Protestant denominations that come to the island. So those are 2 separate curriculums. The private schools are authorized by the state. That is not to say that in the public school system and the instruction of civics and history, that curriculum was deeply informed by U.S. Protestant and ideologies and the idea of providence and the role of the U.S. in manifest destiny. In that way, religion was part of the public schools. But there was a whole system of private schools that were religious, Protestant, that were set up. And then there were Catholic schools that continued to exist as well. There's a strong Jesuit tradition in the private schools in Puerto Rico.
Did you explore in your research the position of I go back to the Catholic schools and in the 1950s and the creation of, because I think they came with the same idea of Americanization of the education system.
I did not, but if I could hear more, so I did not work with Catholic schools or private schools, but you're saying that the Catholic school project of the 1950s was as deeply shaped by Americanization ideologies as
there were nuns from here that went to Puerto Rico, the same as religious organizations, and the idea was, and it was started by also Muñoz Marín when he was governor of the island, of the Americanization and creating an American elite that could be like culto and educated. And I wonder how that really affected or impacted the public education system.
Absolutely. So the limit of my study very much is that I go to the 1940s, and then I stop there in terms of and the 1940s is really a period where I discuss parents and students. So I don't have more or forward from there, but I think that's obviously sounds like a really important contribution to the discussion of education and cultural nationalism.
This is great.
I was wondering if you believe that this Americanization has affected or been reflected in the protests that take place in Puerto Rican universities today?
Well, you know, the University of Puerto Rico is first and foremost a site of protest against the colonial state. And it has, since its founding, and that means in the 1920s, the 1930s, again in the 1950s, the 1970s, 80s, more recently, about 5 years ago, the University of Puerto Rico has been a location for manifestaciones or declarations of anti-colonial activity. That's a whole history that has always been against Americanization. What's significant is that, significant to the story within my time period is simply that the University of Puerto Rico was founded as a teacher's college, right? It was a normal, what's called a normal school in that generation. The intention of the University of Puerto Rico was to train teachers to work in Puerto Rican public schools. And so the first generation, it was a normal school, and then it became, there was a competing institute of teachers in
San Germán. Interamericana?
Humacao.
Humacao.
I'm going over here. Over here, Humacao. So there's a normal school and there's competing institutes, teachers institutes, that come together to become the University of Puerto Rico. Foundationally, the University of Puerto Rico, fundamentally, it was meant to teach Americanization, to teach and train support for U.S. colonialism in Puerto Rico. In the 1920s, you have a new generation. By the 1920s, the people that are students there are Puerto Rican born, and they're that intermediate generation. By the 1930s, intolerant. The university students are fundamentally intolerant of Americanization. And the university itself becomes a location where support for nationalists is carried out. And that is not to say it is an impressive space for pro-nationalist sentiment at the time.
If that is the case, the reports of the commissioner are trying to paint, we are doing our work. How, in some sources at the U.S. level, how are they dealing, or how are they representing these types of failures?
Yeah. So the success of Americanization and schools depended on a centralized government. So until I think 1917, or maybe the 1920s, the U.S. president appointed the Commissioner of Education in Puerto Rico for public schools, and that individual also served as the chancellor of the University of Puerto Rico. And that individual's report was to document their intention and their support for the successes of Americanization. In governor's reports or in versions and drafts of it in the archives, you will find an acknowledgement of nationalist activity emerging at the university, but we have it under control. And so that becomes the most crystal clear during Jose Padin's administration, where he's seen as the first administrator after Juan Bejeque, who was an adamantly pro-American but Puerto Rican commissioner. Jose Padin was one of the first ones to even question whether to report on the successes of Americanization. And so his fidelity to his position was questioned, and he was fired. And he was replaced then by another commissioner who could document as best they could in these government reports successes. Successes of Americanization. It's very contested, deeply, deeply contested story at every level.
So you had mentioned about the possibility of looking at some of the images and talking about that, and I'm just wondering if you could do that a little bit, because I'm looking at this group of teachers, and you know, they seem to me to be very young, to be very light-skinned. So, and just in a context of, you know, I'm going back and forth on something you said, and you think maybe these are Florian teachers who couldn't be. But maybe it's not as simple as that, and maybe, I mean, because when you're talking about the paternalistic kind of way that they dealt with their students and their parents, and that they also brought, they were resisting Americanization, they were complying with a different kind of sort of looking at students as empty vessels and needed to be regenerated, right? So just talking about that a little bit, you know?
So, and who are they to do that? You mean, like, how are they?
Yeah.
Okay. So these images are from the 1920s, and often there's two things happening. Often those who become teachers, if they're from the highlands of Puerto Rico, represent the socially descended coffee elite. And so the whiteness that you see in the representation is that many of these are those who have lost their class status in the coffee districts and now have moved to the urban centers. And so they don't, the children of those who used to be large coffee merchants, they have very specific definitions of race, ethnicity, whiteness, purity, gender, and honor, right? At the same time, some of these teachers here, and this is one of the images that shows very light-skinned. Remember, it's a photograph from the 1920s, nevertheless black, right? There's probably less, if I go, I don't want to I get dizzy when people switch these up. There's probably less in this image if you look all the way in the back to some of the black men. And this, like for example, very light-skinned, but maybe phenotypically black. In addition to the socially descending children of the coffee elite who were white or identified themselves as such, are the rising children of the urban artisans. And so, especially in the Ponce region and in San Juan, you have the children of the artisan class. And the artisans were defined themselves often as, they didn't define themselves as black, but casa de color. So they saw themselves as different than the white elite or children of the elite. And so, nevertheless, the teaching profession in the majority, in the beginning of the 20th century, was primarily male. And it was a profession of poor black and mulatto men in some ways. It quickly became the profession of women. This was part of the US influence. So women were considered to be the appropriate people, representatives in the classroom. And it became wider and wider, as the images show, from the 1900s to the 1930s. There's very little census data, but of course the whiteness that's recorded in census data is socially constructed itself. So we have children of elites, rural elites, we have children of socially upwardly mobile artisans of urban centers who are teaching in urban schools and who are teaching in rural schools, in the campus, where there's one school and it's a wooden schoolhouse. And they're not even welcome there because the presence of teachers in rural areas means that those children are not working in the coffee fields, in the sugar fields, or in the house. But teachers had a very strong sense of themselves. I mean, the professional dress, I mean, this is typical professional dress of the 1920s and 1910s, but what they were not was barefoot. Well, let me show you what they were not. Don't get dizzy. These are their students, right? Now, these are images of their students, actually from the 1940s. This is a Jack Delano photo from the 1940s. So, of rural children coming home from school. This is the image that I chose for the cover of my book because I like his defiant stare at the camera, right? He's like, you know. But these are the children, and so while you have children of that intermediate group in the classroom, you also have children of the rural poor and the working poor. In teachers' writings about what they should teach and how they should teach, they're deeply derogatory. I mean, they're derogatory about class, like nobody's business, you know. How to simplify for the simple Ibara. I mean, really, we have to know what we're dealing with. The simple Ibara needs special instruction, wrote the urban teachers. And there was grave concern over what were considered not homeless, but public children in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s in Puerto Rico, in the city areas. Children of seamstresses and other working women were abandoned in the streets. Many children of color in Puerto Rico. Obviously, this is because women did not know how to mother. They did not know the appropriate mothering practices like they did. And so they had to teach them how to mother. They had to teach the father how to be responsible. So that's what I mean by derogatory and patriarchal and paternalistic. Those were the beautifully dressed teachers. These are their students. You know, teachers, that's a class dynamic that has not gone away, I would think. That's the goal of teachers, is to teach certain values. So that comes through in the writings as well. Yes, ma'am.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the linguistic profile of the teachers and the students.
Linguistic profile in terms of what?
Bilingualism.
Okay. Okay, so as you study linguistics, there's a long history of language in Puerto Rico. I mean, if you want to put your finger on the most abundant and contested literature, it's an English language instruction in Puerto Rico. So what happens is that you have teachers in Puerto Rico in the 19th century who have been practicing. The Americans come and they decertify the classrooms and all teachers, right? And they set new rules and laws and regulations. And one of the requirements for teaching in a Puerto Rican classroom is English language mastery. So all those who had been teachers before the Americans came in were decertified, had to learn English, had to be tested in English, and then they were given their classrooms once again. So from the very beginning, Puerto Rican teachers who are native Spanish speakers had to manage the English language to get permission to work in the classroom, whether or not they taught in Spanish or English. Okay. Now the summary in 2 sentences or less is that I'll say it like this, between 1900 and the 1940s, English was the dominant language of instruction, with some exceptions. Between 1916 and the 1930s, elementary school, there were some exceptions in elementary schools where children could be taught in Spanish. That came as a result of a 1925 Columbia University study. So there's lots of varieties. We go year by year in terms of what the language of instruction is for elementary and high schools. Despite the variety, if I put up a table, what you can say is English was the required language with exceptions for elementary schools in the 19-teens and 1920s. Somebody imagined that Puerto Ricans were going to be English speakers, right? That they were going to send enough American teachers that spoke English to Puerto Rico, and somehow they were going to become English speakers. Puerto Rican schools were, not somehow, in the tradition of Native American boarding schools, really. Puerto Rico was a densely populated island. It required, the number of teachers grew from 1,000 to 3,000 to 8,000 by the 1940s. These are native Spanish speakers who have a working mechanics of English and never, I'm exaggerating, did not teach in English. Those who rose in the ranks of the Department of Education spoke English very well. And there were English was taught as a special topic in addition. And if you look at oral testimonies of students from that generation, students who were in schools in the 20s and 30s will remind you of the ruler that rapped their knuckles when they were being taught English. So English was taught by Americans. Puerto Ricans were traditionally native Spanish speakers with some working mechanics in English. And then it was a failed experiment, and eventually, failed obviously in the 1940s, but recuperated again in the 80s and 90s. Language debate goes on in Puerto Rico, as some of you may know. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Thank you for your presentation. I have two main questions.
Yes, sir.
One of them is, what was the definition of successful Americanization at that time? That's one. And then the second one would be, considering the new take on Puerto Rican historiography that you're taking when it comes to this matter, what are the political repercussions of your findings today? Your political repercussions.
The political repercussions of my findings today?
Yeah.
Okay. You might have to answer that question for me. We can talk about that. Okay. Repercussions of my findings today. Well, there are many, but I'm not sure that I can listen.
Okay.
Okay, so let me go. That one we'll discuss as a group. But to your first question, one of the differences between the 1970s literature, there's an assumption that Americanization means to become a U.S. citizen and to become an American. That was never the goal, right, first of all. Navarro Rivera's work, the author who writes about tropical Yankees, says, let's acknowledge that Puerto Ricans may have been U.S. citizens, but they were second-class U.S. citizens. So the goal of Americanization was to make them aware of their responsibilities as colonial subjects, of second-class citizens. Okay, the literature of Peter Smith, who's in law, but he does history and history of citizenship, will say that in the early 20th century, who had citizenship rights in the United States, right? White males of property did. And so there's very specific, women did not. Women and children were in one category. Native Americans did not, African Americans did not, Puerto Ricans would never, right? So there's a very specific racial hierarchy in the United States. The example on the island is not meant to supplant that hierarchy. It's just, so Americanization meant preparing Puerto Ricans to acknowledge their role in a racial hierarchy within the larger U.S. empire. That's one way of defining the success of Americanization. Another one would be docile labor. Right? There's an argument that the goal of schools was to teach enough English or mechanics or hygiene or home economics so that you had a docile labor force for U.S. industry in Puerto Rico. For U.S. and elite Puerto Rican industry in Puerto Rico. And that could be docile sugarcane cutters who were not docile. It could be docile tobacco farmers who were never docile. It could be the coffee workers who were never docile. And those who eventually would, they just were not. But the goal, if you look at the Marxist argument, is that the goal of Americanization was to create a docile labor force in Puerto Rico. So you just have to provide enough hygiene to allow for reproduction and health and family and labor, right? And so that's considered a definition of Americanization. Okay, political repercussions of my findings today, in terms of what more specifically?
Because what honestly comes to my mind is whether these efforts of Americanization, today we see in Puerto Rico a significant push of towns naming their streets in English. I think of Guaynabo City, right? And then I'm like, is what you studied then, that was, you could argue, was one direction, well, maybe it's not one directional, right? But it was a more nuanced dynamic where people were overtly trying to be Americanized. Now you have Puerto Ricans, mostly from the island, buying into naming things in English, motu proprio, like they're not being asked by the federal government to do this. They're doing this themselves, and then that's what the issue of success of Americanization comes, and that's the political consequence of today, I think. Whether there's some remaining element of that now we see coming up in different blossoming or coming up in different ways, where instead of Americans telling you need to do this, now you have Puerto Ricans teaching their kids to speak in Spanish, in English at home, and the success of knowing English in many people in Puerto Rico today is to quote unquote not have an accent, right? That's to dominate English in certain classes in Puerto Rico. They speak English with no accent. So that's what I was thinking of.
Okay, well, I'll say two things. One is that, let me see how I can say this. What year is this? 2014. So Puerto Rico has 116 years of a colonial relationship with the United States, right? So Americanization, I'm talking about one phase of Americanization. It's redefined in the 1940s and 50s. It means something else in the 70s and 80s, and in the 90s and today. So the practice of claims to an U.S. identity, which is also a claiming of a global identity, a neoliberal identity, a cosmopolitan identity, I think it always has to be rooted in the cycle, in the historical moment. Okay. So I can say broadly that, as we know, Puerto Rico for 116 years or longer, 200 years, has had a history of political practices that were either pro-annexation, Spain or the U.S., separatism and independence, or autonomy. These are 200 years of, 150 years of these ideologies. Today's version, I think what you're referring to as the most current version, I would say we cannot simplify it and say that Puerto Ricans are trying to be Americans. Right? I would not do, Guaynabo City is a spectacular example of a neoliberal identity. But neoliberalism is not always defined in relationship to the Americans anymore, right? In the 70s maybe, but I don't know about today. So I think today's phenomenon would be different than this little historical moment of 50 years. I think today's phenomenon has to be put into conversation with definitions of globalism and neoliberalism, in addition to a layer of 116 years of a colonial relationship to the United States. And then, in addition to that, say, but let's not talk about the Puerto Ricans who are trying to be, then we have some that are pro-annexation today, so that are pro-separatist today, and so that are pro-autonomous today as well. And some that challenge all of that and celebrate certain gender and racial differences and stuff. Right? So I don't want to, so that's what I mean. I don't even know if that's an answer as much as a distance and framework for me. Okay.
Thank you.
Also, I think that,
Go ahead, for conversation.
could we have, yeah, very good. Could we have one more question and then we can just have some cookies, some cheese, and we can ask her some other questions in private.
I want to let go, but I think also the process of immigration that has happened in Puerto Rico, I did that as my dissertation. So you have been talking about something that I look at another aspect, and how that revolving door migration really impacts also. So like you're saying, I think
That's one
it's
additional
not only one.
fundamental
Yeah.
level.
Mhm.
Thank you for your questions and for your
It was
time.
awesome.
Thank you very much.
Oh, we can have some.